Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Jewish Book Week. I'm delighted to be able to introduce this event that has been sponsored by my parents, David and Judy Dangor. They chose this evening in particular as I had the pleasure a few years ago of working with historian and author Andrew Roberts on a 3-part BBC documentary series about Napoleon, and was able to see firsthand how passionate and forensic he is when researching a subject. He will go to the ends of the earth to ensure his understanding is authentic and original, quite literally in the case of Napoleon, where he journeyed to the remote island of St. Helena, where Napoleon ended his days, only accessible by a 5-day voyage across the Atlantic by post ship. Andrew is visiting research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and recently turned his attention to Churchill, another great and highly complex leader, drawing on new sources to reveal Churchill more intimately than ever before. His book, Churchill Walking with Destiny, has spent 9 weeks at the top of the New York Times bestsellers list. This evening will be chaired by David Horsball, author and history editor at the Times Literary Supplement, who co-edited The People Speak, Voices That Changed Britain, with Anthony Arnaud and Colin Firth. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to David.
Thank you very much. Actually, sorry, just before you do, can I pay tribute to Anna for doing this while she is 9 months pregnant? Yes. She's sitting at the back just in case her waters break. And also to say that that the 5 days, or in fact 6 days, so 5 nights on the boat to St. Helena was not particularly interesting after the first day. Especially as I had to, for some reason, you had to sit next to the same person. The placement was such that you had to sit next to the same person at every single meal. And in my case, it was a Swiss railway engineer. And I only know a certain amount about Swiss railways, and I got through that by the time of the first course.
Well, tonight, Andrew, you've got me. So,
Thank you.
Well, I'll try and improve on the Swiss railway engineer. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. And let's talk about Churchill. Churchill's appeared once again. He's barely ever out of the news, but he's appeared once again in at least 2 national newspapers, if not more. And one thing that occurred to me as a way of asking about this vast subject and the pretty big book that you've written about him was maybe to talk a little bit about
just
the myths.
always display the product.
Yes, there we are. I may need to get it back from him at some point. Talk a bit about some of the myths that have grown up about Churchill. Some of them grew up during his lifetime, some afterwards, some constructed by his enemies, some by his friends, and a lot of them, I would say, by himself. He was a great self-mythologist. I thought it might be a nice way to start our discussion, just to run through some of those great myths. So I thought
can
maybe
I choose a couple?
Well, you can. I'll start you off,
okay,
and then we'll dive. We won't necessarily go from cradle to grave. I think we'll dart about. But let's start with his childhood. The thing I knew from reading my early life was that Churchill was an academic dunce. You know, he was terrible at school, and his great success afterwards was despite rather than because of his education. Is that true?
It's very rare, isn't it, for people to try and make them, especially politicians, to try and make themselves out to be thicker than they actually were. But Winston Churchill did. In my early life, as you say, he talked of himself as having been at the bottom of the class and very bad at pretty much every subject. Completely untrue. We have Winston Churchill's school reports. Pretty much all the way through when he was at St George's Ascot, all the way through to the end of Harrow. And the fact is he was in the top third of every class in pretty much every subject. He was particularly good at history, of course, as one would imagine, but English. He was not the dunce at Latin and Greek that he claimed to have been either. The headmaster constantly writes about this intelligent boy who is nevertheless the most naughty person in the school. But nonetheless, it was a true act of self-mythologizing to have made himself out to have been less intelligent than he was and less successful at school than he was, in fact.
And he had he displayed that prodigious memory very early on, didn't he, at school? 1,200
lines of Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome, where 1,200, imagine, obviously young boys have very fungible brains, but nonetheless 1,200 lines is quite extraordinary. And the great thing about this was that he had, it wasn't so much a photographic memory as a phonographic memory. He could remember phrases and sounds and noises. And so very often, especially in the great speeches of the Second World War, you see him bringing out phrases, drawing out phrases from his past and from poetry and from Shakespeare in particular, and using them. And so many of the great phrases, we shall fight on the beaches, the never in the field of human conflict, blood, toil, tears and sweat, they have provenance from things that he had read much earlier in his life. And there's a marvellous moment, specifically with regard to Shakespeare, where in the Second World War, Field Marshal Smuts and he had a competition about who could quote the most Shakespeare. And after a quarter of an hour, Smuts just gave up. And then soon afterwards, he realised that actually Churchill was making it up.
Yes, yeah. So I think we're agreed not a dunce, despite what
no,
he
not
told
easy
us.
to invent iambic pentameters.
No, exactly. So after school, he didn't, like everybody does today, he didn't go to university, which was not particularly uncommon at the time either. He went into the army. And, well, one of the myths that might be said to have grown up about him as his early life as a soldier and then a journalist, which professions he combined, was that he liked to put himself at the centre of everything. Possibly even to the detriment of the story or even the campaign that he was on. How would you treat that kind of?
Well, I think that one of the things that we sometimes forget about Churchill and his time in the army, and he fought, of course, in 5 campaigns on 4 continents, and 4 of the campaigns by the age of 25, was that because he combined this role of soldier and war correspondent, and by the time of the Boer War, he was the best paid war correspondent in the world. He had effectively written himself out of the chance of a medal, of a gallantry medal. He got plenty of other medals because he had fought in all these campaigns. But had he not been a war correspondent, it's, I think, absolutely certain that he would have won a gallantry award for the time that the Boers in the South African War ambushed his armoured train, the way in which he fought at the Battle of Diamond Hill and Spion Kop. On both of those occasions, he would have got some kind of gallantry medal, which of course was something he desperately wanted, but which, because he was looked down on by the establishment, not socially, of course, he was grandson of a duke and so on, but because of this way in which he was sort of cashing in on the war, he never got the thing that he really wanted, which was a gallantry medal.
It was a recognition for his bravery, yeah.
And this side of this physical bravery is absolutely essential. You can't understand Winston Churchill unless you appreciate that he, as well as his moral courage, that we'll, I'm sure, get onto later, that he was a man compounded of physical courage too.
But yes, he really does seem to have had total courage under fire, for example, from a very early stage.
There's a marvellous line, nothing is more exhilarating than to be shot at without result.
And in fact, I was reminded of someone who I think was quite a hero of Churchill's, which I was reading a biography of Ulysses Grant, who I think was very similar. There were bullets whizzing past him, and Grant would sit there smoking. a rather smaller cigar than Churchill liked to smoke, but the same sort of thing, just one of those people who could carry on life without any compunction under real danger.
And I think both of them also believed that you couldn't hear the bullet that killed you. Which was a widespread belief in the British Army and indeed in the American Army. But I can't see how anyone could ever check that.
Yes, difficult to ask, absolutely. After his military career, which of course he did take up again, it was politics. What inspired him into politics?
His father, and his father, of course, Lord Randolph Churchill, who was an aloof, disdainful, brilliant, and highly mercurial politician, became Chancellor of the Exchequer, of course, and who spotted no hint of brilliance in his son Winston, and instead deluged him with disdain and contempt even. Some of the most painful letters in this book to read are the letters by his father to Winston, in which he cuts him down as much as humanly possible. It's a terrible thing to read, and yet Churchill loved his father. And when his father died, aged 40, when Churchill was 45, when Churchill was 20. Churchill sought out his father's friends. He wrote his father's 1,000-page biography. He called his own son Randolph. He adopted the political views of his father, the Tory Democrat views of Benjamin Disraeli.
He adopted his stance.
His speaking stance as well, and quoted him endlessly. And then, very, very strangely, in 1947, he met his father's ghost. And he wrote about it in The Dream. And at no point did he explain to his father that he had been instrumental in helping win the Second World War. And so you can see Churchill's life very much as an attempt to impress the shade of his long-dead father.
It is a very tragic part of the book, if that's not putting it too strong. I don't think it probably is putting it too strong. For example, the story you tell of Churchill losing his father's gift, I think, of a watch.
Yes, a gold watch, exactly, yes.
And the lengths he goes to try to recover this item, and how annoyed his father is to hear.
He was at Sandhurst, and he employed an entire company of soldiers to dam the part of the lake in which he thought he'd lost the watch. Finally, they found the watch. He then took it to the watchmaker, who moronically told his father about this, and his father was utterly furious with him, and treated him, as I say, he wrote letters basically that no father should ever write to any son.
Yes, and yes, as you say, when he entered politics, it was as a sort of heir to his father's approach. But it didn't do him that much good in terms of his early political reputation. He quickly got a reputation for not being very trustworthy, particularly from his own side. Is that fair?
I think for being pushy and thrusting, which he was, and he was openly pushy and thrusting, not least because his father had died at 45, and 3 of his uncles had died in infancy. As it turned out, also 2 of his aunts died in their 50s. He believed that he was going to die young.
Yes.
And so as a result, he had to achieve as much as he possibly could, as early as he could. And therefore he was seen, especially by his fellow backbenchers in the Conservative Party, as being impossibly thrusting and pushy. But one can understand why as a result of this. And by the way, sorry, we talked about his father, but I think it's also important to mention his mother. Yeah. Because, who, of course, Jenny Jerome, born in Brooklyn, an American, was very unlike most mothers in that she showed absolutely no interest in her sons, either Winston or Jack. In fact, the first time she showed any interest in Winston was the moment that he became a signatory on her trust fund. Up until then, when he was 9 years old in 1884, for the first 6 months of that year, she only saw him for 6.5 hours. And yet, he continued to love her, and there's a very moving passage in My Early Life in which he says that she shone for me like the evening star, brilliant but at a distance.
It's an extraordinary childhood from which to construct such a life. It's just absolutely amazing, really.
You mentioned about how he was. You mentioned how he was not trusted in the Conservative benches. His argument, of course, was that he was elected as a Conservative at the time that the Conservative Party was wedded to free trade, and when it then turned against free trade, he believed that the party had left him rather than he had left the party.
So,
his crossing
the Conservative Party crossed the floor away from him.
Exactly. His crossing of the floor, he felt ideologically, was an honourable thing to have done rather than what a lot of the Conservatives, of course, thought, and indeed a good deal of the Liberals, was that he had done it out of opportunism. Which, of course, was underlined by the fact that the following year, in 2 years later, in 1906, the Conservatives were out of office and for the next 10 years.
So they particularly resented the fact that he jumped ship
at a brilliantly opportune time.
Of course. More widely, sort of beyond party politics, his political views are often, particularly sort of more modern historians, I think, often characterise him as a sort of last Victorian. They will talk about his political views. Do you think that's a fair description, or do you think it, do you think it conceals as much as it?
I think it's fair. It's fair insofar as his views on race, for example, which are obviously tremendously controversial today, even, and need to be analysed. I think it's tremendously important to see to remember the fact that he was born at the same time that Charles Darwin was alive. When he grew up, Charles Darwin was still alive. People believed in a hierarchy of races. And however much obscene and ludicrous that might seem to us today, it was considered at the time to be scientific fact. And not just Darwin, but Huxley and others ascribed to this.
H.G. Wells.
And H.G. Wells and people on the left, of course, also. And so you have, therefore, a belief that that the British race, his belief that the British race was superior to the others. But the great thing about the difference between his views and those of other people who also believed in this neo-Darwinism, at least, was that he believed that, therefore, as a result, and you also get this as a kind of internationalisation of the Tory democracy view, the noblesse oblige view, where the privilege leads to great responsibility. He therefore believed that it was the duty of the British Empire to look after the native peoples, and was completely different, therefore, from the kind of neo-Darwinist Nazi view that you could therefore lord it over the subject peoples of any empire that you were able to grab. That is an absolutely central, crucial differentiation, which I'm afraid too often is not made.
And I think, as we're at Jewish Book Week, we should also talk about his views. Well, I think you described him as a Philo-Semite, which is unusual for his class and his time.
His age and class and background, of course, yes, absolutely.
Which were rife with anti-Semitism. And you make it very clear that wasn't Churchill's view from the beginning throughout his life. Is that true?
That it wasn't?
That
it was.
That anti-Semitism was not.
Oh, I see. No. Yes, his philo-Semitism, he got from his father. One of the positive things he got from his father was philo-Semitism, who, Lord Randolph, liked Jews and ensured that Winston Churchill grew up with Jews, admired Jews, went on holiday with Jews when he was young, and believed, of course, that Judaism was central to the understanding of the ethics of Western civilization, and who also, of course, long before he even represented a Jewish constituency in northwest Manchester, he got on with Jews and became a Zionist, of course, as pretty much as soon as he could. Was a Zionist, of course, also at the time of the Balfour Declaration, and opposed the 1939 White Paper and celebrated the creation of the State of Israel. So, all in all, you have him as taking a completely different stance from the vast majority of his age and class and background, and a lot of the Conservatives on the benches, especially in the 1930s, who were frankly anti-Semitic. And so what this did for him, it's very important not just because of his interest in Jews, but also on a wider sphere, it gave him an early warning system to appreciate what Hitler and the Nazis were all about. It was one of the major things, along with his sense of history, along with his having come up against fanaticism in his own life. You put all these together, and you find him therefore as not only the first, but also to a great degree the only British statesman in the 1930s who spotted Adolf Hitler and the Nazis for what they really were so early on.
So we've jumped forward a little bit to the 1930s. So let's talk a little bit about appeasement and about Churchill's view of it. If we're talking in sort of mythical terms, there is a sort of counter-myth that I think has begun to grow up. I think historians just like putting the other side constantly. If one side's had its day for a bit, historians like to amuse themselves by trying the other side.
We've got to stay in business, David.
Absolutely,
you know?
Absolutely. So what I have read from my desk at the TLS is various books that try, if not to rehabilitate Neville Chamberlain and appeasement, to try and put the case for it as it would have appeared to Chamberlain and his fellow MPs at the time as the sort of only option available to them, to a country tired of war, had been through the Depression, couldn't be expected to rearm at any great pace, and that opposing appeasement was a sort of, I suppose, a luxury position for someone who could take a sort of moral stance, but it wasn't realistic politics. What would you?
Well, I would say that's the old side.
The new version doesn't sound very different to the old version to me.
Well, I mean that argument has been around since the 1930s, and you see it come back again and again and again. But what it fails to appreciate is that when Neville Chamberlain came back from Munich, he didn't believe privately, let alone say publicly, that he'd won a vital year in order to rearm. He genuinely believed he had peace in our time. Yeah. And he also believed that Adolf Hitler was somebody he could do a deal with. He thought that Hitler was going to respect the Munich Agreement. He thought that was the end of the Third Reich's territorial ambitions in Europe. And so if you take the appeasers' views on this and their stance on this seriously, you come up constantly against this problem that in fact Neville Chamberlain was completely duped. And yes, of course, we built Spitfires and Hurricanes that won the Battle of Britain in that period. But Winston Churchill had been saying that we ought to be building the best planes available since 1933. Yeah. And if we had followed his advice and had spent the amounts especially in the air on the RAF, but also with the Army and the Navy, that we could have done as one of the great world economies of the day. I'm not saying that we could have stopped Adolf Hitler in his tracks. We probably couldn't have. But we would have been in a position to have prevented him from swallowing Czechoslovakia and Poland in 1938 and 1939. And that would have led to an entirely different kind of war from the one that he was then able to take out France in 6 weeks in 1940.
Yeah. Now, one of the reasons that people didn't listen to Churchill, apart from the sort of convenience of not listening to someone who was saying some very hard truths, was that an agreement had grown up about Churchill since the First World War that his judgment was wrong. And the biggest reason for that is probably the Dardanelles campaign. I told Andrew before we went on that my grandfather fought in the Dardanelles campaign, but he still admired Churchill. So this is not some sort of long revenge. But the Dardanelles campaign, Gallipoli and all that, was a great failure. And it was Churchill's idea in the first place. Let's put it no stronger than that. Do you think it could have worked?
I think you can put it stronger than that, because
Right.
it wasn't just Churchill's idea in the first place. He was the primary person who supported it and continued to support it for as long as it was supportable. He was not the only person by any means who supported it. The whole of the War Council did at the beginning, of course, but he stuck to it for the longest and therefore became the primary scapegoat. And even until the 1930s, people were shouting, "What about the Dardanelles?" at him at public meetings. And of course, there are loads of other major mistakes that he made in his life, as well as the Dardanelles. I'll come on to the Dardanelles in a second, but it has to be seen also, just to support your opening remark, the gold standard, which he got us onto at the wrong time and the wrong level, the abdication crisis, of course, he was on the wrong side of, women's suffrage he got badly wrong, the black and tans. There are a whole stack of blunders that he had made in his political career. But you're right to say that the number one sort of poster child of it was the Dardanelles. The Dardanelles was, in its concept, an absolutely genius move. Had we been able to have got the Royal Navy through the Dardanelles Straits and anchored it off Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and thereby, through the threat of shelling Constantinople, having taken the Ottoman Empire out of the Central Powers in the Great War, that would have been one of the great coups of the history of warfare. But as it turned out, due to the implementation of it by the admirals, nothing to do with Churchill, he was back in London at the time, but we lost 6 ships, the Allies, not just Britain, lost 6 ships on that one day, the 18th of March, 1915. And then 5 weeks later, they compounded the error, and Winston Churchill was the primary person behind this, compounded the error by landing a huge amphibious force on the western side of the Straits in the Gallipoli Peninsula. And they slogged on the 25th of April 1915, and they slogged up battlefields. When you go there and you see the battlefields and you see how the Turkish machine guns had the complete line of fire, arcs of fire there, it was impossible. And over the next 8 months, they lost no fewer than 147,000 killed or wounded. So of course Churchill, as the primary progenitor of the expedition, took the maximum amount of flack for that. But the great thing about Churchill, really, and this is something that comes back again and again in over the 4 years that I was writing this book, that struck me again and again, was the way in which he learnt from his mistakes. He was a politician who learnt from his mistakes. And the mistake of the Dardanelles taught him in the Second World War never once to overrule the chiefs of staff in the Second World War. He had learnt that message from the First World War. He had every constitutional right to do so if he wanted to. He was Minister of Defence as well as Prime Minister. But at no stage, when all 3 of the chiefs of staff in the Second World War opposed him on something, he never overruled them. And that came from a vestigial memory of what had happened to him a quarter of a century earlier.
So we should get to the war, because there's quite a lot to talk about. He came to power as a result of the fall of Chamberlain, who would have preferred Lord Halifax to take over, and Churchill famously stayed silent when the discussion was had?
No, he didn't. No, he didn't. No.
I like to put in these myths for, for Andrew to tell us the truth.
Okay. Well, this is one of the great myths as well, I believe. He said in his autobiography that he stayed silent for as long as his war memoirs, the first volume of his war memoirs. He stayed silent for as long as the Remembrance Day service, the long 2-minute silence. Nobody else remembers it like that at all.
And it sounds pretty unlikely
and
for
it sounds
Churchill.
pretty unlikely for Winston Churchill to stay silent for 10 seconds, let alone 2 minutes. And he had never done that in the past. Whenever in his past he had wanted and believed that he had the right to take a political office, from junior office all the way up, and including in the 1930s, he asked for it, he demanded it sometimes. And the idea that he was within his grasp getting the premiership, something he'd hoped for 40 years, and that he just suddenly went silent in the hope that it would drop into his lap as a result of the self-denial of Lord Halifax. And I also wrote a biography of Lord Halifax back in 1991, so I can see this from both parties. Is just simply not sustainable. He got the date of the meeting wrong in his memoirs. He got the timing of the meeting wrong in his memoirs. He got the number of people in the room completely wrong. There were 4, not 3. He was telling a story, and very often barnacles of myth attached to the bottom of a well-sailed story. And that's what he was doing in his autobiography. I think that, and I set it out in chapter 19, I tell you what everybody said about that meeting at the time and later, so you can make up your mind as the reader. It's very important that, I'm not in any way didactic about this, but here in a meeting now, I can say that I think absolutely Winston Churchill demanded the premiership, and he knew that the other 3 people in the room could not deny it to him, because he had been right about Hitler for 10 years when they hadn't been.
And something else he wrote about that moment gives you your subtitle. He wrote that it had been a preparation, all his life had been a preparation for this hour, and that he had been walking with destiny, as your subtitle says. How important is that idea of walking with destiny, which seems quite an unusual thing for a historian as you are, who are absolutely immersed in archives, in material, that sort of thing. This concept of destiny doesn't seem to sit with that approach. How important is it in your approach to Churchill?
No, it doesn't, because psychologically and intellectually, it's very difficult to believe in a sort of destiny of that nature. But it doesn't matter whether I believe in it or not. Winston Churchill did about himself. And he, as you say, he wrote, again in his war memoirs, about the day that he became Prime Minister, on the 10th of May 1940, in the evening of that day at Buckingham Palace, when the King made him Prime Minister. And on the morning of that same day, of course, Adolf Hitler had unleashed blitzkrieg on the West and had invaded Holland and Belgium, and Luxembourg was shortly, a few days later, to also invade France. And he said of that day, I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been a preparation for this hour and for this trial. And so what I try to do in this book is not only to unpack the idea of his preparation, and the way in which he'd been First Lord of the Admiralty twice, he had been Chancellor of the Exchequer and Home Secretary and Minister of Munitions in charge of 2.5 million munition workers during the Great War, but also the beginning of that sentence, the bit about walking with destiny, because I think it is absolutely essential to any understanding of Winston Churchill to appreciate that he himself believed he had a special destiny. When he was 16 years old, when he was a schoolboy at Harrow, Churchill was almost entirely self-educated because he had to be, because he went to Harrow.
You can say that.
So can you, by the way. He said that, he said to his best friend that there will be terrible struggles and great upheavals in our lives. However, I believe that I shall be called upon to save London. When England is under danger of invasion, I shall be called upon to save London and save England and save the empire. He said that when he was 16, and everything that happened to him for the next 30 years or so underlined this sense of destiny, especially his extraordinary number of close brushes with death. He nearly died as a child when he was being born.
Interesting enough, that's the passage that I've marked in the book there.
Is it?
Is exactly that, because I love you list.
Can I go through it?
Yeah.
I'd love to. Yeah, no, that's kind of...
You list them, and it is just the most extraordinary list.
It is incredible, isn't it? This is a boy who, when he's born, 2 months prematurely, that in itself is extremely dangerous in Victorian England. The second thing is that when he was 10 years old, he was stabbed in the stomach by a school friend, obviously not a very close friend. He was, at the age of 11, nearly died of pneumonia, and on that occasion the doctors administered brandy to the 11-year-old. Both orally and rectally, which you might have thought would put you off brandy for life, but didn't in Winston Churchill's case. No. He nearly died in a very near drowning accident in Lake Geneva when he was 18. He jumped from a 30-foot bridge and was in a coma for 3 weeks. He had a house fire that he was involved in where at 3 o'clock in the morning the stately home that he was staying in burnt to the ground, and he managed to survive that. He was involved in 2 plane crashes, 3 car crashes. In the middle of this, in the middle of his forehead there, literally down there, you can see it in this wonderful photo by Yusuf Kash, taken in 1941, but 10 years earlier, in December 1931, he had been crossing Fifth Avenue in New York between 76th and 77th Street, and had looked, because he was an Englishman, he looked the wrong way, and a car hit him, and he was in hospital for 3 weeks there and very nearly died as well. And those, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, were only the peacetime close brushes with death that he came to. In the First World War, he went into no man's land no fewer than 30 times. Got so close to the German trenches that he could hear the Germans speaking in them. He, on one occasion, left a dugout, and only in the front line of the trenches. And he didn't need to be in the front line. He was a lieutenant colonel of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. He could have stayed back in battalion headquarters, but he didn't believe in that. And he had only left the dugout 5 minutes before a German whiz-bang high explosive hit the dugout and decapitated everybody inside. And on that occasion, he said that he felt that he could hear the beating of invisible wings above him, and one looks in vain entirely for any sense of Christianity in Winston Churchill. He wasn't a Christian. In the 5.6 million words that he wrote and the 6.1 million words that he spoke, he never uses the words Jesus Christ at all. However, he did believe in an Almighty, although theologically, when you look into it closely, the primary duty of the Almighty seems to have been to have taken care of Winston Churchill.
Important job, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, so I know what Churchill might have answered to this question, but do you think Britain could have won the war without Churchill as the Prime Minister?
Well, it all depended on whether or not we were going to be able to be successfully invaded by the Germans in 1940. And after Dunkirk, it did take an extraordinary act of national sort of resurgence to ensure that we were ready under all circumstances, and also victory in the Battle of Britain, and also for Hitler to have concentrated everything entirely on that. It also required, after Hitler and Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June 1941 attacked the Soviet Union, it required us to stay in the war. because that way some 30% of the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht had to stay back in order to guard against, to protect Western Europe. And as it was, when Hitler did invade, he managed to get to subject Leningrad to a grueling 1,000-day siege. You had cannibalism in Leningrad. He got to the subway stations, the underground stations of Moscow, and of course also captured Stalingrad in the south. So you desperately needed Britain to stay in the war after May 1940, and the only other person who could have been Prime Minister other than Winston Churchill in May 1940 was Lord Halifax, who wanted to make peace with Hitler in May 1940. So the key thing that Winston Churchill did, I think more even than any of the great meetings with the Americans and his meetings with Stalin and so on, all of the various strategic decisions he took and all of the interaction with Field Marshal Lord Allenbrook, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff and the Chairman of the Chiefs General Staff, the key decision was to stay in the war in May 1940, and he wanted to do that, and Halifax didn't.
And Halifax would have taken Britain out of the war.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes, yeah. And so if he'd been Prime Minister.
And he was, we were talking just before we came on stage about his relationship with Clement Attlee, and it's important to say he led a national government, not a Tory government, and the support that he got, that he managed to bring people from very different parts of politics, as it were, with him.
And you mentioned your grandfather having thought that Churchill was right over Gallipoli. Well, so did Clement Attlee, of course, very importantly.
Who had also been there.
Who'd also been there, and indeed was the last officer off the last boat off Suvla Bay to evacuate in January 1916. And so you have, therefore, this man who admired Winston Churchill as a strategist become his deputy prime minister and the key person who kept him in power for the next 5 years. And so, and Churchill always remembered that, although, of course, politics being what it is, he made jokes about Clement Attlee after the war. He never forgot that act of tremendous patriotism, not just joining the government in May 1940, but also not imposing the demands that somebody like him could have imposed if he'd wanted to. Instead, he allowed Churchill to decide who was going to go where in that cabinet, in that government. And so it was a tremendous act of patriotism that Churchill never forgot.
I see the time's marching on, but before I throw open to the floor, I'm sure you will have some very interesting questions to ask Andrew. But I did want to ask you about your sources that you drew on in the book, because Churchill has been written about, as we know, such a lot. What new sources did you find?
Yes, there are no fewer than 1,009 biographies of Winston Churchill.
I read them all.
So I'm often asked, not least by my wife actually, why on earth I had the hubris to impose a 1,010th on the public. But the answer is actually that there has been the most extraordinary avalanche of new sources about Churchill, important new sources over the last 10 years. The Queen allowed me to be the first Churchill biographer to use her father's diaries. And King George VI met Churchill every Tuesday of the Second World War. They had lunch together at Buckingham Palace, and they served themselves from the side table because they couldn't have anybody else present, because Churchill trusted the king with all of the great secrets of the Second World War. He told him about the nuclear secrets, he told him about the ultra decrypts, which ministers and generals were going to be hired and fired, which countries were going to be invaded when and under what circumstances. And there was no particular reason that they should have got on. As we mentioned earlier, the abdication crisis, Churchill was on the wrong side.
And he was a great supporter of Chamberlain as well.
And the king was a huge, staunch supporter, exactly, you're right, David, and that of appeasement. And so there's a chance they couldn't have got on, but actually it's very clear from the diaries that right from the beginning, they put the nation first, both of them, and very soon became fast friends. In fact, the word friends comes up in the King's diaries. And the King wrote down everything that Churchill said after these meetings. And so you have this wonderful new source, the last 10 years, these many great sources have come up, but that is a particularly great one, which I have mined quite extensively, as you can imagine. In fact, of the King's 4 prime ministers, Churchill was the only one who he called by his first name.
Really? Yeah.
And then there have been 41 sets of papers that have been deposited at Churchill College, Cambridge, since the last major biography of him, including Mary Soames, Winston Churchill's daughter's diaries. There have been the diaries of Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador, 1932 to 43, who met Churchill a lot, especially during the Nazi-Soviet pact, which is tremendously important. My own researches for my book, Masters and Commanders, allowed me to discover the verbatim accounts of the War Cabinet, which had never been seen before. And so we now know who said what in all of the War Cabinet meetings, and that was a very exciting thing to have had. And the Churchill family have been tremendously helpful as well. They allowed me to use the love letters of Pamela Harriman, which Pamela Harriman led a very active romantic life during the Second World War. She, as well as, of course, being married to Randolph Churchill and having a baby by him in the Second World War, she also had an affair, famously, of course, with Averell Harriman, FDR's envoy, who she subsequently married. But also an affair with Jock Whitney and Ed Murrow, the great journalist, and General Kenneth Anderson, and Marshal of the Air Force Sir Charles Portal. And someone that we just know of as Jerry. Anyway, I had exclusive access to her papers, but clearly nobody had exclusive access to her.
On that salacious note, I think we should throw questions open to the audience now. There'll be some very helpful people with microphones roving around. So if I can ask you, if you put your hands up as people are, the people with microphones will come to you, and do not please start asking your question until you get a microphone. Maybe some 2 people here in the front row. Can we start there?
Mr. Roberts, can I compliment you on your fantastic book? I'm on page 200. It's taking me a long time to get into it.
Oh.
As you have said, the sources are fantastic. My own criticism is it's so heavy and cumbersome, I'm having great difficulty in reading it in bed.
I have an answer to that. I also got the recorded version, which is extremely well read. I can't remember the name of the actor who does it. So you can have both and just keep going like that. Very good idea.
I was very interested to hear, although your talk is very short, that you mentioned, and I've made a note of this, he was a Tory Democrat. And I think it's page, lost my note, page something, 128 I think it is. You mentioned the various social reforms that he either instigated or set up with Lloyd George. And I think many of the public are not aware of this. For example, he was the one who introduced the pensions to this country. Mm. My question is slightly off course. Do you think that if he was around today, he would be the best Prime Minister that we would have, forgetting Theresa May and Brexit, although he may not have been in favour of Brexit, would he have been the ideal Prime Minister in this day and age?
There's one for you, Andrew.
Winston Churchill's daughter, Mary Soames, told me never to assume that one could ever tell what Papa would have thought about anything. And so I'm not going to get drawn into the Brexit row with regard to Winston Churchill. He died half a century before the referendum. However, one thing I think he'd been very, very good at is tweeting. That is one area of politics in which, because a lot of his ripostes were absolutely superb and could be fitted into 280 characters or fewer. There's a marvellous moment where he was making a speech in the House of Commons and an MP shouted "rot" at him. And he immediately replied, "I thank the honourable member for telling us what's in his mind." I'm sorry that the book is long. The fact is that, and don't drop it on your toe. Obviously, you wouldn't do that in bed, but nonetheless. The problem is that he was in the front rank of politics for nearly 2/3 of a century. And he had something to say about every great issue for 2/3 of a century. And so, try as I might, and I did, to keep this within manageable limits. Actually, it could have been 10 times the size without any difficulty whatsoever. I took 5 million words of notes for this book. And I have to say that of the many more than dozens now, scores, perhaps even hundreds of emails that I've had about this book over the past 6 months since it's been published, I haven't had a single criticism that it's been too long, and many that it's been too short. No, I know you weren't. You weren't at all, sir. No, thank you.
At the back here, yes, you have a... Could you hold the two?
Looking at the period May to July 1940, in your view, to what extent was Churchill responsible for the internment and deportation of German-speaking refugees to the Dominions?
He was very responsible, of course. It was a knee-jerk reaction with a lot of people. They feared that the Austrians and Germans and Italians, in the event of a German invasion, would have formed a fifth column in this country and would have fought on the side of Germany, Austria and Italy. They based that on the fifth columns that undoubtedly had existed in Holland and Norway, amongst other countries. And so and Churchill considered and stated that the internment without trial of anybody was, in his words, in the highest degree odious. And that's why from 1943 onwards, when the immediate danger was over, then they started to allow people, including fascists, members of the British Union of Fascists, Sir Oswald Mosley being an example, and also his wife Diana Mosley, to leave prison. They cut down the number of people who were interned by the maximum amount that they possibly could. It was not his finest hour, undoubtedly. However, there was a moment of national emergency in which I think it was justifiable, and nothing on anything like the same scale as the kind of internment that, for example, the United States was conducting against the Japanese after Pearl Harbor.
Here in the second row.
Can I join my colleague in congratulating you on a very elegantly written book and well-researched book, which I very much enjoyed?
You most certainly can. Yes, thank you very much indeed.
Well, I just did.
That's kind of you.
I want to ask you, having finished your 4-year journey of really getting into the soul of this man, when you look back at your research and when you look back at the book, what delighted you the most, what surprised you the most, and what made you the most disappointed in Winston Churchill, the man?
Golly. OK, let me try and remember those in order. What delighted me the most was how much fun it was. I jumped out of bed in the mornings to research this book, not least because you always knew that you only had to read... Churchill wrote 8,000 pages of speeches, gave 8,000 pages of speeches, but you never have to go more than 3 or 4 pages without finding the most fantastic joke. And so there are at least a couple of 100 Churchill jokes in this book, because his sense of humour is essential to understanding him as well. The thing that surprised me the most came, in fact, from the King's diaries, and that was quite how frustrated he was And of course he could never say this publicly. You could never say this in the House of Commons or in a speech or anything, but nonetheless how deeply frustrated he was by the glacial speed at which the Roosevelt administration moved towards bellicosity against the Germans in the Second World War. He, and indeed, of course, it took Hitler to declare war on America in December 1941, and he saw the Second World War right from the word go as a Manichaean struggle between good and evil, and between civilization and democracy on one side and the most evil political system the world had ever seen on the other. And so he couldn't understand why the greatest democracy in the world was not trying to move faster towards helping us. What was the third question? The most disappointing. I have to say, I was disappointed. I was disappointed by, although I mentioned earlier about his great jokes and how funny they were, there were an awful lot of frankly, sort of substandard racist remarks that he made. He made about Indians. He made about people who I know I'm seeing it, of course, through the politically correct eyes of the 21st century, rather than when he was making them in the 20th century. But nonetheless, I don't think they were probably that funny at the time, and so I suppose that was the moment I was most disappointed in him.
In the front row here.
My understanding is that Churchill was a big fan of the EU, but for the French and the Germans in the early days, certainly. My question is, do you think his physical bravery was as a result of his belief in his destiny, that he felt that he would be, kept alive to continue his destiny?
Yes, well, just to pick up on that first point that you made, absolutely. He believed that Teutons should never fight Gaul again. This is what he said in the late 1940s. He had lost so many friends in the First World War and the Second World War, that he hated the idea that it might all happen again. But and this was the gravamen of his remarks at The Hague and Zurich and Strasbourg and the great speeches there. But when he became Prime Minister in 1951, he didn't move towards any of the multilateral organisations that presaged the Treaty of Rome in 1957. So you're absolutely right about that. With regard to, you're going to have to remind me the second part of your... His physical bravery, yes, of course. Sorry, and also I should have made much more. His physical bravery did indeed was indeed underlined by this belief that he was being saved in order to save London and Europe and England and the Empire. But also, of course, on top of that, there was his physical bravery in the Second World War, where he, even once he'd become Prime Minister, where he undertook 110,000 miles as Prime Minister, and outside the United Kingdom. And so he was, in many senses, the glue that kept the big three together. Because, of course, Roosevelt was profoundly disabled and Stalin didn't like flying. And so he was the one who kept going around in unpressurized cabins, very often within the radius of the Luftwaffe. On one occasion, his plane was struck by lightning. Had the instrumentation gone down, that would have been the end of him. So you have this extraordinary physical courage that continues throughout his life, but also the moral courage. And I don't think I made enough of this when I was speaking to David just now, because in the 1930s, he was shouted down in the House of Commons. He was nearly deselected for his seat by the Conservative Party after Munich. He was attacked as a warmonger. He was lambasted in the press and in public, and he never changed his stance on Hitler and the Nazis. He despised opinion polls. He took no notice of. He never had a speechwriter. He never had a spin doctor. What you got from Winston Churchill came straight from him, and so I think that that decision of his not to change his message because of his unpopularity was a great act of moral courage. And when the gentleman asked about what we would like to see in politics today, a little bit more of that, actually, would be something that I think would be extremely popular.
I think we've got time for one more question, I'm afraid. Maybe that gentleman in the red jumper who's leaning forward eagerly.
We've been talking a lot about blokes this evening. It seemed to me that a very important element of your book was the relationship with Clementine. And I'd like you to talk a bit about the importance of that, her role, how significant she was. And also I'd like you to address the question of whether Churchill was faithful, because there's a lot of tittle-tattle in other books about he apparently playing away from home. But with all the work that you've done, I'd be very interested to hear what your view on that was. So first,
yes,
yeah.
I'm afraid you only have a minute to do so.
No, I will
sum
sum up in a minute. Yes, there was in my view, completely ridiculous television show recently. I'm not going to mention the names of the people who were responsible for it. Nonetheless, they produced absolutely nothing in the way of evidence to suggest that Winston Churchill was unfaithful to Clementine at all. And I don't believe for a minute that he was. I've looked into this deeply. I've read all of the letters from the supposed mistress that are at Churchill College archives. There's one letter, by the way, this supposed affair was supposed to have started in 1933. He gets a letter from her in 1937 with saying, and my telephone number is, and gives a 4-digit Mayfair code, okay? Anyone who's had an affair with somebody for 4 years and can't remember his mistress's 4-digit telephone number is clearly not a brilliant adulterer. But with regard to Clementine, the question you were asking, there really is a proper, lifelong bond of love there that is something that sometimes moved me profoundly. Any man would be so proud to have a wife who could write a letter like the one that she wrote to Asquith at the time of Churchill's forced resignation. She gave him such wonderful advice that sometimes cost her emotionally, because the advice about how he had to stay in the trenches in order to save his political career in 1916, she knew that he was subject to sniper fire on a daily basis. What it must have cost her to have written that letter. And then in 1940, to have told him that he needed to behave better to his secretaries and nicer to his staff, and you know, he was becoming a beast and needed to. I mean, can you imagine anybody doing that to Adolf Hitler? She was a rock for him from the moment that she married him until the moment he died. And so I think anyone attempting to sully that is frankly beneath contempt.
Well, on that uxorious note, I think that's a very nice place to end. There are only two things that remain to me to say. The first is that it says here, book signings will be taking place directly outside the hall where the event is taking place. Not very well drafted, really.
That's a classic remark from the TLS editor there.
I should have subbed it before I came on, I do apologise. Anyway, signing outside there, but much more importantly, to thank Andrew Roberts very much indeed for his tremendous
Thank you very much.
and for talking to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's very kind of you. Thank you.